folks. Tom with the Heavily Biased Top 10. We are looking this week at the Week 10 review, plus the rankings reaction. We just had the release of our first college football playoff rankings from the committee, and so we'll kind of look at that in a part of this. But as we're kind of diving in, I wanted to look at this week's ranking here at the end of the Hugh Freeze era, and just see where we are. So a little bit of a different order this week. We'll look at conference race updates first, talk a little bit about where each of these conferences are right now and kind of what's going to go out ahead in the next few weeks. Most of these conferences are down to about 4 games left, some of them 3 with their conference leaders, just kind of depending on who they've played. And so we're really getting to kind of see the shape of it, and we'll run down the SEC, the Big Ten, the ACC, and the Big 12. We'll do cold, hard facts. So I'll give a little bit of insight into how I break down numbers and what I do. And it's one of those things where you can kind of see terminology. And my terminology, I try to keep the same as we go throughout things. And so if you get a chance to understand it here, then you'll understand it later on when we talk about it and put it in numbers. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, if you're listening to it on YouTube, there is also a YouTube version of the show where you're going to see slides as we get into more definitive things in the next few weeks. I will often put some numbers behind some of what I'm talking about with strength of schedule and just kind of ranking and where I put teams. So do check that out if you get the opportunity. After cold hard facts, we'll get the Heavily Biased Top 10. We'll talk about conference ranks and contenders, and then we'll do a little run through the CFP rankings and reaction. Let's go ahead and dive on in. So, updates first, the SEC. The top pair were idle this week, and that means Texas A&M and Alabama, who are both 5-0, had this week off before continuing with a final run that finishes their conference and regular season slates. SEC plays 8 conference games, and so both of these have 3 remaining. For Texas A&M, that's going to be an interesting run because that does include a game against a very surging Texas. So there's a lot still kind of at stake here. Georgia and Ole Miss are both a game behind, but they have also played a game ahead. So both of these are 5-1 with only 2 conference games left. 4-1 Texas has played the same number of conference games as Texas A&M and Alabama have, with the 1 loss there to Florida, just kind of as a surprise in the mix. Texas has an interesting schedule laid out ahead of them because they do wind up with Georgia, Arkansas, and Texas A&M, and they're picking up at the right time. So in knocking off Vandy at home, they have really kind of cleared themselves a path. They hold tie-breaking games against both Vandy and Oklahoma. So a couple of teams that are also kind of fighting for playoff spots out of the SEC, they are sitting ahead of. And it puts them in an interesting position going forward because out of the group of them, Texas has kind of the most realistic shot to play their way towards an SEC championship game. Now, granted, they do have a hard road. That would include some big-time wins. And, it's going to be no small feat to beat both Georgia and Texas A&M in your final 3 games. Bear, we're going to be quiet, buddy. I know you want to be on the show, but you're going to be quiet. We have a giant coonhound. All 135 pounds of him. By the way, Smokey 10, we're thinking of you, buddy. Good luck. But we do have a giant coonhound named Bear Bryant because, he's my first coonhound, but I'm not going to have a Tennessee coonhound and not name him something Alabama. So, also, there you go. The Big Ten. Let's move on to that. So this is a nothing to see here league. And what do I mean by nothing to see here? Ohio State and Indiana both have cruise control schedules. The only meaningful game left on either of their schedules is the Ohio State versus Michigan game. And that one actually could be very impactful. For the remainder of it, Indiana, nothing left on their schedule. I mean, nothing left on their schedule. The remainder of Ohio State's games, nothing left on their schedule. They will play true bottom feeders of what's left in the Big Ten, and should be heavy, heavy favorites in every single one of those. Ohio State should be a heavy favorite against Michigan. I mean, this is not a game that feels like something Michigan should win, but the way that it's impactful, we'll see. Ohio State has not been forced to play a game really all season. Yeah, Texas, okay, that's great. You played them at home. Texas, we have seen, was a struggling team at the beginning of the year. I don't know that the outcome is any different as far as the winner if you played that game today, but I do know that these are very different teams now than they were at that point, especially both of them starting new quarterbacks. So what we see here is that the only meaningful game left for Ohio State and Indiana combined is that Ohio State versus Michigan game, and it could be very impactful because should it play out that Michigan wins out and beats Ohio State, they would replace Ohio State in the Big Ten championship game. It'd be a weird situation because that would likely mean that Ohio State still winds up with one of the byes after not playing in their conference championship. Be a really messy situation. The rest of the mess. Oregon is in the best position, but out of the groups that are X1s, they have a terrible strength of schedule. They do have a few games coming up that really will add to that strength of schedule, but their best win right now is against a 5-3 team. So it's not like they've got a huge win out there backing them. Oregon versus Iowa this week is big. This is an eliminator for Iowa, who have already lost a couple of games. It's possibly an eliminator for Oregon, just kind of depending on how they do down the stretch, or how bad the game is. So if Iowa were to lose this, they are truly out of the picture. If Oregon were to lose this, I'm not sure they're completely eliminated because they do have remaining games against both USC and Washington. And so there's still time for them to kind of tune their way back in, and work their way into a 10-2 team that's a part of the conversation. However, for Iowa, this is it. This is their eliminator. If they fall out of this one, they fall out of the picture completely. Washington and USC, speaking of, are also contenders. Either would need to win out in order to have any meaningful shot, because both of them have 2 losses already. But they are in position where should they do that, picking up a win against Oregon along the way, they are in contention for a possible shot out of the Big Ten. It's really kind of interesting where it goes. The odd part there would be USC over Michigan head to head. Michigan kind of needs help. They can help themselves to a degree, but they are in a position where they're probably a 1 loss away from being just kind of a also-ran in the Big Ten. I've thought a lot about this since I wrote Sunday night, or Saturday evening into Sunday night. And the ACC is really, for me, falling backwards in the course of the season. Miami's loss took a lot of luster out of kind of what could be in this conference. Georgia Tech did not help. The fact that both Georgia Tech and both Georgia Tech and Virginia have lost to that Georgia Tech has lost to NC State is really an interesting thing here. Virginia is now the solo leader, 5-0. They are not the favorite in all of their remaining games. They play at Duke coming up shortly, and that's a game Duke is favored to win, which would make a really interesting scenario. Georgia Tech is favored in all their remaining. They should run out their ACC record to 7-1, all things considered, but that would possibly put us in a situation where NC State, uh, who played a non-conference game against Virginia, is a factor in deciding the conference between Virginia, Duke, and Georgia Tech. So a really, really odd place to kind of work through this. Pitt, Louisville, and SMU are all still alive. SMU, with, of course, the big win this weekend against Miami, really put themselves in a great spot to be able to kind of make their way towards whatever they want. They're still an X1 in conference. Louisville's still an X1 in conference. Pitt is still an X1 in conference. And Pitt can really play a big factor in what we see going forward. This is a team that still has games against Miami and Notre Dame. They're a big time player in what we're going to see out of the ACC, if we're going to see anything major out of the ACC. So we'll kind of see where things go. But I do think that since writing earlier this weekend, the conference has really kind of taken a step backwards, and we'll see that reflected with the conference ranks. The Big 12. BYU is the last remaining unbeaten, and that is after Cincy took it on the chin this weekend. The interesting part here is that BYU has remaining games against both of the two remaining X1s. And so Texas Tech and Cincinnati are both 5-1. That means that it really comes down to how those games play out. BYU wins out, then the best conference record they could possibly play against would be somebody that's 7-2. BYU beats Texas Tech. That 11th game against Cincinnati really can't hurt them because they're still going to wind up going. They would take that victory over Texas Tech. Texas Tech would have 2 losses. It wouldn't matter what happens in the Cincinnati versus BYU game the first time. Should they beat Texas Tech and beat Cincinnati, then it'll be between Cincinnati and Texas Tech, most likely, as far as who goes, or it will fall to a larger X2 tie, which I'm not going to delve into right now. Should Texas Tech beat BYU, then it's going to be down to that 11th game where BYU is taking on Cincinnati to determine who takes on Texas Tech, barring the Big 12 being the Big 12. Because as we have seen, the Big 12 is always one of those conferences where, unlike what happens in the Big 10, the bottom teams can beat the top ones at basically any time. I've said before, and I'm going to stick with this until proven otherwise, Big 12 is a very, I won't call them very deep, they're a very wide league. They're in a position where the top is not that far from the middle, and the middle is indistinguishable from the bottom. Right now, that's going to hold true probably unless you are Oklahoma State or Colorado. Yeah. All right. Let's talk metrics real quick. I am not going to run through every single one of these this week. I did write them when I wrote up the major. And so if you're looking for the written version of this elsewhere, then you'll see the actual numbers with them. I'll start putting those with these in the next couple of weeks as we get a little bit closer to things and as we discuss these a little bit more. But I wanted to kind of give you the idea of the metrics behind things and where I look at them. And try and get some terms established so that we know what we're talking about week to week. Strength of schedule. Strength of schedule is fairly standard, and that asks how good are the teams that you played, and that is regardless of your outcome against them. So if you played and you were 0-12 against a bunch of teams that all went 12-0, you played a very hard schedule. Now, you're going to have no victory record and you're going to have a horrible strength of record, but you played a very hard schedule. If you played a bunch of teams that were 4-8, well, your strength of schedule is not going to be very good. You might be 12-0 against them, but that's going to harm your victory record and your strength of record rather than that's going to harm your strength of schedule rather than your victory record necessarily. Bear. Shh. Hey, buddy. I know. We're not going to talk about them. Victory record. Victory record is a quality measure, and that's going to take into account the strength of schedule based on the teams that you have beaten. I do not include FCS teams in either the strength of schedule or the victory record. Strength of record is an adjusted metric, and that looks at the victory record based on who you lost to. And so if your loss is to, as Alabama's is, if your loss is to a 3-5 team, that's not a good loss. If your loss is to a 7-1 team, as is Georgia's, that is a much better loss. I keep a composite list. I've got a spreadsheet of these where I work through these metrics and adjust them weekly. And I work to rank these teams week to week. Right now, just so that you know, when I put together the composite and try and bring through rankings before I go back through and adjust based on how these teams look, what is their actual record, and where I think they should play out versus how have they played games, the numbers themselves actually have Ohio State and Georgia tied at number one. And so, we do go through, we adjust them based on the record, based on who you played. Are some of these other teams that are in this top 10 teams that you have lined up against, vis-a-vis Georgia versus Alabama? But there we are. All right, heavily biased top 10. We're going to start 1 through 5. Ohio State. I usually, as I said last week, don't make micro adjustments or don't make major adjustments for teams that are on buys. Texas A&M was on a bye this week. Ohio State was not. Ohio State played a Penn State team that has a very terrible record this year that was not live up to par, especially with a team that was AP ranked in the top 2 to start the season. But they have not lived up to that in the slightest. However, consistency on offense. This isn't a team that has looked at any point like they are playing more than an up-tempo practice. 55 points against them all year. Penn State scored the most points anybody has with 14 in the first half. And in spite of that, this was never really that much of a game. They bumped back up to solo number 1 this week. I have a small gap in the schedule. OSU's 8th win caught up in that metric. That bumped them ahead of Texas A&M, who sits at number 2. Number 3, I have Alabama. And the reason I have Alabama is that when we compare the best wins between Indiana and Oregon, because these two on paper match up pretty well in spite of the fact that Alabama has a loss. When we put Georgia versus Oregon and we start to compare where is this best win, because these are two 7-1 teams, it's miles away. And the College Football Playoff Committee actually talked about this, that says that Oregon is by far the worst strength of schedule in the top 10. The win at Athens is a much better win than the win at Eugene. And while I can grant that Indiana has been a very dominant team in their games this year, with the exception of that win in Oregon, this is where we've got it. Indiana, yeah, okay. You're 8-0. You're right here. You were going to be in the top 4. It was just a matter of where. Their strength of schedule, especially the strength of schedule remaining, is awful. And it will come down to how they do against that schedule and how does Georgia finish out against theirs to see if Georgia actually skips ahead in my rankings. Georgia's 5. The one loss to Alabama, some fairly good wins along the way. They will have a couple of big games coming up. They've got Georgia Tech still. They've got Texas still. This is a team that still got some challenges out there, and they've been building into them all year. Ole Miss is at number 6. They are locked behind Georgia on a head-to-head. BYU is my number 7 this week. I did make some adjustments, as I said, after kind of some more thought and consideration. But BYU, the Big 12 championship path, is really to be determined over the next 3 games. Right now, they're the leader. Right now, they're the undefeated. And so right now, they're sitting at the top rank that I've got for a Big 12 team. Number 8, I've got Oregon. Again, an awful strength of record, an awful victory record, holding them back. They've got room to move because they've got Iowa, Washington, USC still on their schedule. So there's a lot of stuff out there that they could still move around with just based on who they play in their remaining games. Texas Tech, we're going to give Texas Tech not really a pass here, but we're going to give them a little bit of grace here in the fact that their one loss came in a game where they lost their starting quarterback. They lost it on the last play of the game after surging back into it, even with their backup. They have played very well once they got their starting quarterback back. It's going to be very interesting to see between them and BYU who winds up kind of pairing into that championship game. And if they can keep consistent play. And that's been the challenge for the Big 12 over the years. I've got them sitting at number 9. Number 10, I've got Notre Dame. This was an interesting thought and kind of a thought between, what do you do with a 2-loss team that lost 2 very close games at the start of the year, but has looked very solid down the stretch. I don't think that their schedule has shaped up to be quite what we thought. And the 2 hardest games that they had, they lost both of. But very much like I said about Texas and Ohio State earlier, I think that this Notre Dame team, as you see it right now, is playing at a level that is well above where they were playing when they lost to Miami. I don't think Miami is playing as well as when they beat Notre Dame. I think that this is still a very tough match, Notre Dame versus Texas A&M. And I think that's still a very close game, but both teams have grown a lot where the Miami one probably has not. My watch list here is Texas and Oklahoma. And as I said, after some more thought, I have moved the ACC grouping down a bit out of this. And I've got Georgia Tech and Virginia down some since I first wrote this list on Sunday. The ACC is rapidly approaching a 1-bid league. Speaking of bids and leagues, here's our conference rankings with the contenders. This week I have the SEC at 4.4. I've got them with basically four spots pretty solid, as long as they don't kind of play their way out of it over the next couple of weeks. The contenders that we have are kind of in order of their most likely appearance, and that is Texas A&M, Alabama, Georgia. Ole Miss are all kind of moving their way towards it. As long as they don't have major stumbles on the way, I expect that all 4 of them are likely to be playoff teams. Texas is ahead of Oklahoma and Vandy, who they have head-up wins against, though, as we've said, Vandy and Oklahoma both have some big games out ahead of them. Texas has some big games out ahead of them. It is very possible that should Texas win several of those games, they could still make the field and the other 4 still be a part of it. The Big Ten. I've got them down a little bit this week at 3.3. Ohio State and Indiana are pretty much locked in. I think that Oregon probably winds up in just based on what they're doing right now. But the other contenders here, USC, Michigan, possibly Washington, outside chance of Iowa, but they would have to win out and be very impressive in some of the things that they do. The Big 12. I don't think the third team gets in. But right now it's between BYU and Texas Tech. And I think that Cincinnati, especially what you saw in that loss to Utah, is a lot more the Cincinnati that we actually have than a team that was undefeated. Or undefeated in conference. It's them or it's a chaos champion. If it's a chaos champion, it's probably a chaos champion plus the second spot, just kind of depending on who it is. But there's a lot of different ways that kind of comes unglued. If BYU wins out and puts both Texas Tech and Cincinnati into a large tie with a bunch of X2s, you go to a whole line of tiebreakers. And if that happens and then BYU gets upset, then we're talking about a situation where that might not put them out of the picture, and that we get a basically at-large conference champion. But that would probably be two of them, because you might get that out of the ACC as well, based on where the committee put them. The ACC I've got down to 1.1. They are really on the bubble of being locked at 1, and I do think that that's where they're headed, is to just a one solid bid and one extra maybe. Right now that's Virginia or Georgia Tech. There could be the option of a chaos champion, and we'll kind of see. If it's a chaos champion, that's the only team that's going. G5 right now is looking like it's the AAC champion, and I think the best team in that conference right now is Memphis. There's merit to saying San Diego State, but Memphis is the highest ranked committee team so far. And then I've got Notre Dame bumped up a little bit this week. I've got them at a 50% chance to make it. I think that it might actually be a little bit low, but that's where I have them right now. All right, real quick, let's run through kind of a reaction to the CFP rankings. This was a slide that I was waiting to put on because, well, I couldn't do it until the rankings were out. And unlike some of the rest of this where I have put pretty extensive thought into it and have written a column already, this one is basically unscripted. So here we go. All right, reaction to the rankings. Ohio State and Indiana, no surprises. These two, as undefeated, are sitting there. The one thing that I still have here is that I am okay, if we're going to look at these as just kind of the rest of our rankings, and we have Oregon at 9 and Notre Dame at 10, sure, I guess maybe Indiana's best win is slightly better than the one at Texas A&M. I think that Texas A&M's overall schedule matches up very well, but as I said previously, I think that my metric put Georgia in a tie with Ohio State. And then I had to adjust back based on who they played and how. So I don't think that there is as wide of a gap here, 1 through 5, as it might appear. All of these are good teams. All of these are very strong, and when they are playing well, all of these are just fascinating to watch. I'm not knocking Ohio State. I think I put them at number 1 as well. I do think that Indiana is overranked. Texas A&M, again, no surprise. Committees love that X0. Alabama being the highest ranked one-loss team is also no surprise. With the exception of their first game, they have played a very tough schedule, have played through it very well, beat the teams that they are supposed to, and beat them rather handily in most cases. They handled their business at Georgia, which is still the best win of the year. And that's of any of the teams on this list. So I think that's an easy fit at number 4. Georgia, right there behind them at number 5. And look, the second best win of the year, Georgia versus Ole Miss. Sure, we lock them right there in, very much like the Texas and Alabama a couple years ago. I think that those two, should they stay at X1, should they stay at 11-1 through the year, they move together. And you're not going to have a lot of things that pop a team in between them somewhere. BYU and Texas Tech at 7 and 8. This is kind of a nod to where the strength of those two teams are, but it also tells you a lot about where we think the Big 12 is. That they're behind 4 teams in a row in the SEC and the top 2 teams in the Big 10. So I think it's a wider gap 6-7 than it is 5-1. Um, that said, these two play each other this week. So we're going to have some separation and some delineation between the two immediately. And it'll either be Texas Tech's second loss, which will probably drop them well back towards that like spot where Utah is right now at 13, or it'll be BYU's first loss, where again they have beaten Utah. So I think that either of those is going to push those behind another couple of SEC teams, and just kind of put them in a spot where we're really seeing that the strength and depth comes from the Big Ten and the SEC. Oregon at 9. It's the worst schedule by far in the top 10, but they've gone through it 7-1. They've got a chance to prove their merit with the next 3 games, or with 3 of their remaining games. We'll see what happens. Notre Dame, we've discussed. They've lost to a Miami team that has kind of fallen off of late. They lost to a Texas A&M team that is number 3 in this poll. Of those best losses, they're sitting 3rd because Georgia versus Alabama, Ole Miss versus Georgia, and then we have that Notre Dame versus Texas A&M. They're sitting 3rd with the best loss out of the 3, but they have 2 of them. Texas and Oklahoma locked in here together. Both of them with a couple of losses, both of them with some big games still out ahead of them. Either one right now are sitting in a position where they would be out, because you don't see the ACC on this list as far as inside the top 12, which means that an ACC champion would push somebody out, and your 4th ranked or your 5th ranked conference champion would push somebody out. So 11 and 12 would both be out if we stopped today. Utah behind them, I think that's a good team, not necessarily a great one, but it's the other team that can kind of make a push. You notice that Cincinnati is not in there, even though they are the team that is kind of ahead in there. This is a Utah team that beat that Cincinnati, but has a couple of losses. Virginia, your highest ranked ACC team, followed immediately by Louisville. Notice Georgia Tech, who lost this week, is not there. Their schedule, again, similar to some of these others, has not been as strong, though they've, while they were 8-0, that was a possibility. And now that they're not, they're well down that list. Vanderbilt pops in there at 16. I think that's about as far as we reasonably should look outside of a G5 champion, to see where teams might come from. Because although we have some games remaining between several of these, the room for growth is going to be pretty tight. Our Big 12 teams that are kind of close are well back, and they're in a position where, the wrong losses, they're going to be bumping somebody out of a playoff spot that might otherwise fit the top 12. The ACC champion right now, if you played this game between Virginia and Louisville, would push somebody out. And so you do have a lot of kind of interesting spots for depth. Down the list, you had USC and Michigan, who, again, have the ability to kind of play their way in. Iowa is down in there as well, who has the ability to kind of play its way in. And then, as we said, the 5th highest ranked conference leader, they continued going past 25 just to get to Memphis. All right, that's what we got for this week. Here we go. So we will see you guys next time. Enjoy the week. Primer coming up in the next couple of days.